my book club, they mentioned the American Renaissance. I never knew there was such a thing. We should look it up sometime.
The idea of a Renaissance was a really amazing one. It was a new idea by a man named Matheson. He was contradicted later. They said that he had a narrow idea because he only thought of men and no women or African Americans. But the idea that he generated, that American literature could build on something from the past and create a new path to the future, was a really good idea.
When did it happen?
So it actually started officially around 1830. It carried on through the end of the Civil War, and it actually started a little bit before that, but it was very slow to progress.
To build in the past means there was an American literature before the Revolution. Was I ever? Have I ever heard of it?
You might have, thanks to Hollywood and Johnny Depp, almost everybody knows who Ichabod Crane is. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But there's also Rip Van Winkle. You've probably heard about the man who fell asleep for 20 years. There was nonfiction. There was some stories of captives that were captured by the Indians and then they got released later. There was some histories in there too.
What was this Renaissance all about? There was a lot going on.
There was a lot of change going on because it was a brand new nation and everybody was still trying to figure out what it really meant to be an American. So there was reforms. There was slavery reforms. There were women reforms, temperance reforms, the slavery reforms. Douglas and Stowe were
Douglas, Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist,
yes,
and Stowe must be Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin.
that's right, exactly. So they were actually writers, and the British were eating it up because in 1834 the British banned slavery, and they really liked the fact that America was struggling over this. Some of the other writers, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, we already talked about Harriet Beecher Stowe, Ralph Waldo Emerson, um, let's see, Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau. He actually gave a speech once at a um, gathering that was really scathing. The Massachusetts had just decided they were going to start returning the escaped slaves back to the South, and he gave a speech that was just scathing. And during that same rally, they actually burned a copy of the Constitution. You know, Melville actually said
Didn't he write Moby Dick?
he did. He actually said that white supremacism was a stain on our on our national culture. Um, and it was really interesting too because Douglas wrote a speech towards the end of his career called Lessons of the Hour, and he actually called on the nation to live up to the founding ideals, the ones where there was actually human brotherhood and the how do they say, the self-evident truth of liberty and equality. He said, if Americans would only be willing to do that, then all of your problems would be solved, and your, how did he call it? Your republic would stand and flourish forever.
Slavery was an important issue for sure. You mentioned women's reforms too. Is that about votes?
Some of it was. There was also issues about women's rights because basically they had none. Women also were starting to write fiction and poetry. So much, in fact, that the men started to think that the fiction and poetry were just for women. Hawthorne, Hawthorne made a comment once that his Puritan ancestors would be aghast to know that he only wrote storybooks.
It's too bad because the writing and poetry was amazing.
Yes, it was. You know, one of the writers who actually worked to try to change the way the country viewed fiction was an excellent writer himself, but he spent most of his life being dead broke. Edgar Allan Poe. And then, of course, poetry. Poetry allowed women to write from home. It allowed them to show that they had some kind of an education. So they actually published a lot of poetry too and writings.
I know the temperance people were about banishing alcohol or something. They changed lives. But what does that have to do with literature?
I think the best way to say you would see the temperance influence would be in some of the works. Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a really good example because the villain was a drunkard. And some of the other things, that's probably the easiest way for you to recognize the temperance is from the fact that the villain had become a male drunkard in their story. So it was kind of showing that it broke down lives, and it was they had that was their way of showing the damage that it did.
How is all this new writing so different from British writing?
Um, I think that's one of the things that made the Renaissance, a true Renaissance, because they were trying to break away from being copycats from the English writers. Um, Cooper wrote a series of books about the American frontier and the exploration of it, and they were starting to call him the American Scot. And he was actually offended by that because he didn't want to be an Americanized European anymore. He wanted to show that he was an American in his own right. It's true that Americans did have to share the market, and they competed actually in the same market. Some of their themes might have been the same, but their style was all their own. It was becoming truly American, especially after they got into transcendentalism.
What?
It was kind of a philosophy, I guess, an idea, if you will. Um, it was emphasizing that um, intuition, the way that you felt about something, was a way for you to be able to know about God and the universe and even yourself. Emerson was a proponent of that. He was anti-church because they didn't believe in miracles, and he felt there were miracles every day. And also, he believed that the power of imagination could be almost godlike because it was limitless.
They had some big ideas. What did they write about?
Lots of things. There was the value of history. They wrote about how a person can know God directly. They wrote about how language can help you get knowledge, and then you can turn around and use your language to share that knowledge. One of the biggest things they had was because of all the problems it was in trying to figure out about the universe and everything they were trying to solve based off just their own intuitions. So it was, instead of having some kind of an authority to teach it to them. So there's a lot to write about.
What made their stories so different?
That would be the depth, I think. Even if the stories, well, some good examples. The Scarlet Letter or Moby Dick, they were dealing with a lot of interpretation, like whether it was the letter A or whether it was the whale. You really had to think. The stories were deeper, maybe a little darker. Um, the first stories from earlier works, like with Cooper's works, they were just common sense stories. They just kind of went along. But the newer stories with the transcendentalism, you really had to think about them.
Wow, I bet they wrote awesome poetry.
Yes, there was poetry in the Renaissance too. One of them was Whitman. He was a really good writer on that. Um, he wrote an entirely new style of poetry. He basically threw all the rules out the window, and he brought humanity back into the poetry, and he created something that's, well, we call it freestyle because it was so new. His poetry was different because it was about ordinary people written for ordinary people instead of scholars. And one of the poems that he wrote, here's a really good example, was called Live Oak with Moss, and it was a story of love, like the whole cycle, from the joys to the sorrows to the heartbreak and everything in between. Um, he was showing that love can go beyond gender, because it just has a life all by itself, pretty much.
What do you mean? Oh, that love is just love?
Well, that a heart talks to a heart, that um, gender really doesn't, it's not an issue with love. Here's an example. Okay? He says, "Oh, you, whom I often sit and silently come where you are, that I may be with you. as I walk by your side, or sit near you, or remain in the same room with you. Little do you know the subtle electric fire that for your sake is playing within me.
That was beautiful. It couldn't be about anyone in love. I see what you mean.
Yeah. Poetry opened a lot of doors. African Americans and women could really break out. It gave them a voice that they didn't have before. Emily Dickinson was a good example of a woman poet. She's very mysterious and inclusive.
I heard about her. They said she was an eccentric spinster.
Yes, and that just means that she kept to herself and she didn't talk to anyone and she never got married. So, yes, she was eccentric and she was a spinster since she didn't marry. But where Whitman just sort of left all the rules off, she used the rules, but she would bend them and twist them and turn them around to make them fit her own style and expressions. And I guess that's pretty much the Renaissance. I mean, the Americans were they were getting away from thinking like subjects who were being ruled, and they started to think like citizens with free thought. Their literature was creating something new, something beautiful and enduring,
Something American.
exactly, something American.